Thank you. I'm actually amazed anyone's here with will.i.am and all the other fancy, sexy people. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. Hopefully that clicked it forward. This is, there was a title in the schedule, which is a much shortened version of this, but this allows me to talk about almost anything. And I'm coming to it shamelessly as a physicist, so I'm going to try to bring to some of these questions a kind of quantitative, predictive, scientific perspective. And I'm going to begin by reminding us of the extraordinary time we all live in. You're familiar with much of what I'm going to say in the next few minutes, but I want to remind you that we live in this kind of exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe. Everything to do with our social structures and our economy are expanding at this extraordinary rate. And just to give you an idea, I've got some numbers down there. 200 years ago, we were just a few percent urbanized. Now we're over 80%. The world crossed the halfway mark just a few years ago. It's heading to the 80% mark towards the end of the century. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that is to recognize that that is equivalent, if you just average over the next 30 odd years, that's equivalent to adding over 1 million people a week to cities. That's actually, it's more like 1.5 million, and that's equivalent to sort of having a New York metropolitan area, that's the 15 million people of the metropolitan area, adding to the planet every couple of months, or a Bay Area every 4 or 5 weeks, or I wrote down a Madrid every month, and so forth. This is extraordinary and is enormous stress and strain on everything around us, everything to do with energy and resources and the whole social fabric. China, for instance, is expanding at an extraordinary rate. It's crossed the halfway mark. It came late to urbanization. It's going to be building in the next, it claims, in the next 15 to 20 years, 200 to 300 new cities, each in excess of 1 million people. And that's just China. There's India, there's Latin America, there's Africa. So the effect of this on everybody is going to be phenomenal. There's no escape. And of course, this is closely related to the extraordinary expansion of the world population. It's gone, when I was born in 1940, it was, the population of the planet was in the 2 billion range. It's now well over 7 billion. And this is just fantastic. And of course, that in itself is associated with this extraordinary paradigm that we developed in the last couple of 100 years of a free market system, entrepreneurship, open-ended economies, and so on, which has led to this extraordinary open-ended growth that we all participate in. And one of the questions I hope to address in the next 20 minutes or so is whether any of this is sustainable, or whether it's just we happen to be lucky, we happen to be around at this time, but in fact, this thing is sowing its seeds of its own destruction. But importantly, this is the only equation in the entire talk, even though this is a science talk. The planet is completely dominated now and will become more so by cities. Therefore, we urgently need to understand them. We urgently need to develop a serious science of cities, if that is indeed possible, involving all of these big concepts. And to begin it, I just want to remind you what the variation among cities, that cities are places of opportunity, of material wealth. This is what attracts people to cities, of culture, of people interacting with each other, good education, good restaurants, fancy places, and all the rest of it. But all of this, of course, cannot exist without a continuous supply of energy. And that, of course, is a challenge for all of us to whether we can sustain that kind of energy. But the thing I want to remind you of is that there's a fundamental law of physics that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, called the second law of thermodynamics, which says, roughly speaking, you just had lunch, you had breakfast this morning, sometime in the next few days, inevitably, you're going to have to go to the bathroom. There is, in putting energy into making order, which is what we do when we create socioeconomic institutions, for example, such as cities and companies, we create disorder inevitably. And it gets, and I want to call that socioeconomic entropy, and that is manifested in things like this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and indeed this. And much of what is going on the planet today which frightens the shit out of us, is actually, I think, a result of this kind of phenomenon, this exponential expansion, and the pressures and opportunities and the tension between them that it creates. And one of the big questions is this what San Francisco is going to look like in 20 or 30 years, or London like this? And at the end, hopefully, I will come back to that. But importantly, in trying to understand cities, we have to recognize that cities are not just this physical image, which is the way the pictures I've shown, its physicality, but more importantly is its sociality. That is the fact that the only point of cities is for people to come together, to interact, to create wealth, to create ideas, innovate, and so on. And that's manifested in situations like this, places where people can sit around, talk, bullshit, create, and so forth. And this picture of New York really shows it, I think, brilliantly. You can really feel viscerally what is that sense of entrepreneurship, that sense of exchange, of ideas, of interaction, and so forth, leading to greater wealth, greater ideas, as I say, greater innovation. And indeed, New York, of course, doesn't look like that anymore. The physical buildings are still there. The streets don't look like that. But the whole point of New York is to create that inside those buildings, as we are trying to do here, is that kind of interactive phenomenon. And that can be thought of in two distinct ways, that tension, the tension between the physicality, which is the energy and the resources, the metabolism, so to speak, of a city or of a socio-economic enterprise, and that in conjunction with, integrated with, as well as in tension with the information content, the fact that in those pictures I showed, information is being exchanged, and in biology that's represented by genomics or neural behavior, and in social situations by creating ideas, wealth, and innovating. So on the one hand, cities and the whole phenomenon of urbanization are the source of all the problems that we feel face us, from global warming, climate change, questions of energy and resources, questions of financial markets and risk, health, pollution, disease, and so on and so forth. But they're also the solution, because they're the vacuum cleaners that suck up all the smart people. That's where people go. So again, this points to us urgently needing to really understand what is this phenomenon that we are all participating in that is growing exponentially. So just to repeat what I've already said, is any of this sustainable? Are there actually laws that underlie this? Can we understand it? And to repeat again that we urgently need to develop science of cities, and for that matter, companies, because they're an integral part of this whole phenomenon. And I've just written down here a laundry list of all the things that we think about when we think about socioeconomic forces of various kinds, and to recognize that when we deal with these, we tend to deal with these in a stovepipe way. And one of the most important things to recognize is that all of these are interrelated and interdependent, and in fact they come together in this extraordinary invention that we've made, namely the city. So let me miss this. So I want to first spend 5 minutes giving you a little primer on biology from this viewpoint, and I've done it by asking a bunch of questions. For example, I can't see you very well, but I can say with almost absolute certainty that everybody in this room will be dead in 100 years, and many of you will be dead much sooner, including me. And the question is, why in the hell is that? Where in the hell does this number of 100 years come from? So that I call a coarse-grained question, and the science behind that a coarse-grained answer. And so there's a bunch of other questions we can ask associated with that. Why is it that mice, which are made of the same stuff as we are, only live for 3 or 4 years? And so on, and where do these numbers come from? And similarly, why is it that you had to sleep of the order of 8 hours last night, and so forth? And turning to socioeconomic forces, which was the title chosen by Dreamforce for this talk, to what extent are cities and organisms biological? And from that, why is it that all companies are going to die? They all die. I hate to even say this, I'll be thrown out, but Salesforce will eventually disappear. Why is that? Whereas San Francisco will persist. So even the greatest and seemingly unviable seem to disappear. So I want to spend a few minutes on biology. We're one of these. We may look different than these, and we cover as one of these mammals 8 orders of magnitude, 100 million in our weight, from the shrew that is about the size of a palm of a hand, less than a palm of a hand, and a blue whale, which is bigger than this auditorium. And we look different, and we live in different environments, yet if we look at almost any physiological variable, such as the most fundamental thing, how much energy does one of these need to stay alive, and you plot it, that's on the vertical axis, against their size, you see something extraordinary, something incredibly simple occurs, and we're talking about what is probably the most complicated, complex phenomenon in the universe, namely metabolism. How do you get from inorganic material life? And there it is, and what is extraordinary about this is that we believe that each one of these organisms and each subsystem has evolved by natural selection with its own unique history. Every cell type, every genome that is part of each of these organisms has its own unique history. So you would have expected, had you plotted anything like this, that points would be all over the graph manifesting this historical contingency. Quite to the contrary, they all line up beautifully, and by the way, this is plotted logarithmically, meaning in English that the axes go up by factors of 10, so you can get a mouse and an elephant on the same page. And the question is, when the hell does this come from? Why is this? And indeed, it turns out that if you look at any physiological variable or any life history event, you have something quite similar. So here's something trivial, your heart rate. Heart rate decreases in a trivial way. Can you go back one slide, please? One thing I want is another slide to the graph. One more slide back. Yes, that graph. The other thing I wanted to say about this slide is the slope of that is 3/4, almost exactly. Now, had it been 1, that would have naively been kind of obvious, because 1 would mean that it's linear. Linear means double the size, double the number of cells, double, therefore, the amount of energy needed. Not true. Double the size, double the number of cells, you only need 3/4 as much. So there's an extraordinary economy of scale. The bigger you are, your cells work less hard than your dogs, but your horses work even less hard. These kind of scaling laws persist throughout biology. There's probably 75 to 100 of them. Here's heart rate decreasing. Here's your brain, your white to gray matter in your brain. This is genes. See, next one. Genes and so on. So all of these are, I could, as I say, show 75 to 100 of these, and all of them have this characteristic of extraordinary simplicity, and they also have the characteristic that the slope of those lines is a simple multiple of 1/4. 4 is the fundamental number that governs the complexity of life, and that is called in the trade quarter power scaling. Now, where does this come from? Well, it turns out, you ask yourself, what is common among all different kinds of life, despite different evolved engineered designs? Networks. We all have functioned via networks, and there's just a picture of different kinds of networks. You're down in the right-hand corner, and in the top left-hand corner, and you recognize some of the others. And it is the physics and mathematics of those networks that gives rise to those scaling laws and much, much more, and a kind of a quantitative predictive theory of much of the way life functions. Let's take it and talk about one thing that is very, very important to all of us, and that is growth. And I'm going to take this idea and apply it to companies and cities shortly. There's growth. We've scaled ourselves individually. And how can we understand that? So here's a very simplistic way. What happens? You eat, you metabolize, that metabolic energy is sent through your various networks to feed cells. At the cellular level, it maintains cells that are there, it repairs and maintains ones that are damaged, and it replaces ones that have died. And that's symbolically an equation. So basically, roughly speaking, metabolized energy is allocated between maintenance and growth, and you can put that into mathematics, solve it, just as one could for the networks. To get those scaling laws, you can solve it for what's called the growth equation, which is how does the weight increase with age? And here's an example for us as a rat. This is weight versus age. And that line, that solid line, is a prediction from the theory. And the dots are the data. And the two important things here, with 2 or 3 universal parameters, the growth of any organism can be described by this. But equally important is to recognize that it explains why it is you grow quickly and stop. And that stopping, that bounded growth, is intimately related to the fact that scaling of metabolic rate was a number less than 1, was that 3/4 less than 1, which we call sublinear, and that was the origin of economies of scale. So there is an interesting interrelationship between economies of scale, sublinear scaling, and bounded growth. And this bounded growth is one of the main reasons why life has persisted for 2 to 3 billion years. There hasn't been open-ended growth. The other thing that comes along with this, it turns out, all driven by the constraints of networks, is that the pace of life slows down. That is, the bigger you are, everything slows down, you live longer, your heart beats slower, oxygen diffuses across membranes slower, and so forth. So there's a general slowing down, and I've just summarized some of the things I said on that slide. So now I want to take that picture, and I'm going to apply it first to cities and then companies. By the way, one thing I didn't say in this, and you see E on that one, I don't have time to explain, but that network theory also explains why it is that all organisms die. So there's this intimate relationship, just to repeat, sublinear scaling, economies of scale, bounded growth, and finite lifespan. Okay. Now let's talk about cities. I'm just repeating what I showed a moment ago, and all of the cities bring together all of these things. And the first question you want to ask from this paradigm is, are cities and companies scaled versions of one another? We just saw that despite the whale living in the ocean, a giraffe having a long neck, an elephant a long trunk, we walk on 2 feet and a mouse scurries around, we're actually at kind of the 80–90% level in terms of anything that you can measure about them. Scaled versions of one another. We are just scaling of one single idealized mammal. That's all mammals that have ever existed, including us, in terms of our physiology and life histories. Question, is San Francisco just a scaled down New York and a scaled up Santa Fe, which is where I live? They look completely different. They have different histories, geographies, and cultures, and so forth. And so, of course, at first it may not appear so, but when you think about it, of course, all cities are network systems. They all have roads and gas lines and so on. They all have transport systems, and they're all supplied by energy. And most importantly, and in fact overwhelmingly importantly, the whole bloody point of cities is that it's people interacting, and this is just a symbolic graph of a social network. Those nodes are people, and those lines are interacting with people. And most importantly of that network is that there's a modular nature to it. We have families, we have groups, we have businesses, and so on. So it has a modular character. So possibly, because of those commonalities, cities are indeed scaled versions of one another. So here's a very mundane quantity. This is gas stations, called petrol in here because it was done in Europe. This is the same kind of plot, the number of petrol stations on the vertical axis, the size of the city, meaning its population in this case, on the horizontal axis. And what you can see, there's pretty good evidence of scaling. Not only that, these are different countries, and they scale, roughly speaking, the same in all those countries. Not only that, that dotted line is linear. These lines have slopes that are sublinear, so it's like biology. The bigger the city, not surprisingly, the less gas stations you need per capita. What is surprising is that it's the same economy of scale no matter where you are in Europe, but it turns out it's exactly the same in China, Japan, I don't know, all Latin American countries and so on, where you can get data. So that's kind of interesting. That does look like biology, but this is the kind of uninteresting part of a city, all the buildings and the roads and all the rest of it, the infrastructure. what is really interesting about a city is something that doesn't exist in biology, namely our social interactions. And what's plotted here are the relationships for wages and what's called super creative people, like all the sexy people in this audience. That's what's plotted on the vertical axis down below. And you can see there's much more scatter in these, but there's, again, very good evidence of scaling. But the slope of these is now superlinear, meaning it's bigger than 1, meaning instead of the bigger you are, the less per capita, the bigger you are, the more per capita, and the bigger you are, more per capita by about 15%. And it turns out that 15% is the same no matter what socioeconomic metric you look at and no matter where you look in the world. As I said before, China, Japan, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, the United States, Portugal, and so forth. So the more you have of each of these, by about 15%, no matter where you are, the more patents, namely, the bigger the city, the more innovative it is, the more crime, the more police, the more whatever's written there, the more restaurants, fancy restaurants, and so on. And there I've just put a whole bunch of things together to show they all scale in the same way, and there's different countries and different metrics, just to give you an idea. So the question is, where in the hell does this come from? This comes from, why is it the same? Japanese cities evolved differently and independently from American cities, but they seem to behave in the same way, despite, again, cultural, geographic, and historical differences. And the question is, what is it? This is just showing the universal behavior of those things plunked on top of one another. And the idea is, oh, and by the way, let me show you the next slide because I want to translate it into English. If you double the size of a city, any of these metrics increases by about 15%, whether they're good, bad, or ugly, if they involve the interaction between human beings, and you save about 15% on all infrastructure. And this, of course, is one of the fundamental reasons why cities are so attractive. So the reason is that social interactions are universal. That is, people are at this kind of scale pretty much the same, whether they're in China, Japan, or the United States, and it is the reflection of that universality of social interactions. And just to show you data, that's that graph I showed before. Down below on this next slide is data that has been used to measure social interactions using cell phone data, because we can measure how often you're calling people and measure it as a function of city size. And you can see down there, that's for the UK and Portugal, just as 2 examples. And you can see it behaves just like all these socioeconomic metrics, and one can develop a theory based on that. So the other thing that comes along with this is, because of this superlinear behavior and this network effect, it also shows why the pace of life increases instead of decreasing the bigger the city. Unlike biology, everything speeds up, and it speeds up in a predictable way. And I'm going to move on from that to talk about growth very quickly in these last few minutes, and then have 2 minutes to talk about companies. Growth is exactly the same. It allocates between maintenance of, say, the city and its growth. And you remember this, it gave rise, when you had sublinear behavior, to this bounded growth. It turns out for cities that this superlinear behavior gives rise to open-ended growth, which is great. So it's very consistent. That's what we want. We want open-ended growth, but it has a fatal flaw, and that fatal flaw is mathematically called a finite time singularity, which roughly speaking says in some finite time, you will collapse. The system will collapse, cannot be sustained with superlinear behavior, which is what we have. And so the question is, how do you avoid that? How do you avoid that collapse? How have we avoided collapse socioeconomically? And the idea is the following, that you grow like this, you hit this dotted line, which is where you would collapse, and you recognize that in order to avoid the collapse, you have to, so to speak, reset the clock, and we do that by making a major innovation. We discover coal, we invent computers, we move on and invent and discover IT, whatever. We do something that has a major paradigm shift so that we can just keep doing it and avoid that collapse, that singularity and that collapse, and do it. So that's great, and that's what we've done, and the data supports that. However, there's another fatal flaw, and that fatal flaw is the theory predicts that the time between singularities has to get shorter and shorter. So we're not only on a treadmill, we're on an accelerating treadmill, and we have to jump from one treadmill to another at an accelerating rate. And all the data supports that. I'm going to miss this out because I'm finished, and they'll throw me off the stage, but I do want to show you the last 2 minutes how to take this over to companies. I'm going to miss this out and go straight to companies and ask, do companies scale? And on what you see there is they do scale. It's plotted here is assets and income of various companies, and plotted on the horizontal axis is the number of employees. The data set that this comes from, which is the complete one, is this one, which is all 30,000 US publicly traded companies in the last 30 years, in the last 60 years. And what you see is that they scale with lots of variance, but they scale sublinearly. The same thing is repeated in China. And you now from this theory, you have that if they scale sublinearly, they're going to stop growing and they're going to die. So here's those 30,000 in their growth. This is their growth over those 60 years. This is renormalized to the stock market. You can see everybody stops. No one grows beyond that. And here's an example of that growth. That's Walmart up to 1990. And if you take the theory and extrapolate from that, that's what you would predict, that red line. And finally, it would predict that all companies would die. And this next slide is the mortality of those companies. And there's a very big analysis that's expanded over hundreds of years. And what you see, just to get you in the picture, this is actually, doesn't matter whether they've liquidated, gone bankrupt, or merged, or been acquired. What you see there, for example, is the mortality. That top line going flat is a probability of 1 that you will die. So I will finish there, and I apologize to the organizers that I went on for a few more minutes. But I wanted to give you a big integrated picture of understanding what the dynamic is at work, not only in the biological world, but in the socioeconomic world, and leave it to you to come to conclusions as to whether any of it is sustainable given this accelerating treadmill. Thank you.